Cold open. The lab printer was still warm when I pulled the second report, the confirmation run I'd ordered myself, off my own genetics company's system at 11 at night, alone in an office I usually left by 6. I had run my own DNA through our lab's ancestry and relative matching pipeline as a routine quality check, the kind of thing genetic counselors do sometimes just to make sure the software is behaving. What came back instead was a message no algorithm should have been able to generate about my own family. 0 shared DNA with either parent listed on my birth certificate. A close biological match, instead, to a woman I had never heard of, living 4 states away, flagged by our system as a probable full-sibling. I sat there at 11 at night with 2 printouts in my hands, 27 years old, staring at proof that the 2 people who raised me, loved me, showed up to every recital and every hospital visit of my childhood, were not, in the language of my own profession, my parents at all. In about 4 minutes, I was going to call the one person in my life who might actually know why. Welcome to the quiet inheritance, where ordinary people face impossible betrayals, and prove that the strongest response isn't always the loudest. Every story ends with a lesson, a reckoning, or a victory worth waiting for. My name is Marisol Kang. I'm 27, and I spent 6 years training to become a genetic counselor specifically because I love the particular, careful work of helping people understand what their own DNA is trying to tell them. I never imagined, not once in 6 years of training, that the DNA in question would eventually be mine. If you've ever discovered that a foundational fact of your own life, the most basic one, the one nobody ever thinks to question, was quietly, deliberately false, stay with me. Comment where you're watching from, and subscribe, because what I found out over the following 5 months is not a story I could have written for a client, and it started with a printer that should never have run that report in the first place. I have to take you back to my childhood first, briefly, because I think the shape of what came later only makes sense once you understand exactly how ordinary, how loved, how entirely unremarkable my family life actually was. I grew up the only child of Robert and Una Kang, in a modest split-level house in a suburb known mostly for its good schools and its unreasonably competitive youth soccer league. My father worked as a civil engineer for the county, the kind of steady, unglamorous public sector job that meant we never had much extra money, but never had to worry either. My mother taught middle school science, and I have exactly 0 memories of my childhood that don't include her explaining something patiently, at the dinner table, using whatever household object happened to be nearest. The water cycle demonstrated with a boiling kettle and a cold window cellular division explained with a bag of frozen peas. I became a geneticist, in a very real sense, because my mother made the invisible mechanics of biology feel like the most exciting mystery in the world, long before I understood any of the actual science behind it. I was, by every account anyone in my family has ever given me, a difficult pregnancy and a harder delivery. My parents had struggled with infertility for nearly 6 years before I was born, a fact I grew up knowing in the vague, sanitized way children know these things, that I was their miracle, that they'd tried everything before finally succeeding through a fertility clinic 2 towns over called Larchmont Reproductive Associates, a name I'd heard, growing up, roughly as often and with roughly as much emotional weight as I'd heard the name of the hospital where I was actually born. My mother kept a small keepsake box, for as long as I can remember, containing the earliest ultrasound photo from that pregnancy, a hospital bracelet, and a laminated card from Larchmont with a cartoon stork on it that had apparently been included in some kind of new patient welcome packet. An object I always found a little embarrassing as a teenager, and now think about considerably differently. I want to be clear, before I go any further, that I do not believe, even now, even knowing everything I eventually learned, that my parents were anything other than completely, genuinely certain that the child they brought home from that pregnancy was their own biological daughter. I want that established plainly and early, because I think it matters enormously for understanding both what actually happened to my family and what I ultimately chose to do about it once I understood the full shape of it. I built my career, after college, specifically in reproductive and prenatal genetics, drawn, I think, by some combination of my mother's early influence and a genuine fascination with the specific, delicate work of helping people understand what a genetic test could and couldn't tell them about their own bodies and their own children. I spent 2 years training as a genetic counselor at a large academic hospital before joining a private genomics company, Helix Compass, that had built a reputation for combining consumer ancestry testing with more rigorous clinical-grade analysis, the kind of company that occupies a useful middle ground between the recreational DNA kits people buy for fun and the specialized diagnostic testing done in a hospital genetics department. I loved the work. I still do. I spent my days walking anxious, expectant parents through what a prenatal screening result actually meant, helping adult adoptees piece together fragments of biological family history, explaining, patiently, the way my mother once explained the water cycle with a kettle, the actual mechanics of inheritance to people encountering it, often for the first time, at some of the most emotionally significant moments of their lives. It was, in fact, exactly that professional familiarity with our own company's systems that led, entirely by accident, to the discovery that ended one version of my life and began another. Helix Compass had recently updated its relative matching algorithm, the software that cross-references a customer's DNA against every other sample in our database to identify likely biological relatives. And as part of routine internal quality testing before the update went live company-wide, our engineering team asked several employees, myself included, to run our own previously submitted samples through the new pipeline as a sanity check, comparing the new results against what the old system had generated for the exact same DNA. I want to explain something here that matters for understanding why this discovery happened at all. I had submitted my own DNA to our company's database 3 years earlier, shortly after starting the job, partly out of simple professional curiosity, and partly because Helix Compass offered free testing to employees as a benefit. That original test, run 3 years earlier, had returned exactly what I expected, a close genetic match to both my father and my mother, confirming, unremarkably, the parentage I had never had any reason to question. I had glanced at those original results once, filed the confirmation away without much further thought, and moved on with my life and my career, the same way, I imagine, most people who take a recreational ancestry test do once the initial curiosity is satisfied. The new pipeline, running that same 3-year-old sample through updated, more sensitive matching algorithms late on a Tuesday night, generated something entirely different. No genetic match to Robert Kang. No genetic match to Yuna Kang. Instead, flagged prominently at the top of the results, a probable full-sibling match to a woman named Odalise Ferreira-Reyes, 29 years old, living in a city 4 states away, who had, according to her own account information, submitted her sample to our database 18 months earlier seeking information about her own biological family background. I sat in my office, alone, at 11 at night, staring at that report for a long time before I did anything at all. I want to describe, as honestly as I can, what that specific kind of shock actually feels like, because I think it's different from most other discoveries in this genre of story. It was not primarily anger, not in that first hour. It was something closer to a total, disorienting collapse of the ground I'd assumed, my entire life, was simply, unquestionably solid. The particular vertigo of a professional who spends her days explaining genetic certainty to other people, suddenly discovering that the most basic genetic fact of her own existence had been, somehow, entirely wrong. My first instinct, trained by 6 years of professional caution around exactly this kind of result, was not to assume the worst possible explanation immediately. Laboratory errors happen. Sample mix-ups happen, even at reputable companies, even at my own company, embarrassingly enough. I spent the next 2 hours, alone in that office, doing the thing I do professionally for anxious clients every single day. I methodically ruled out the boring, mundane explanations before I let myself consider the considerably more disturbing ones. I reran my own sample from a fresh saliva collection I did right there in the office, using a spare testing kit from our supply closet, rather than relying on the 3-year-old sample that could, theoretically, have been contaminated or mislabeled at some point in storage. I compared the chain of custody records for both my original sample and my fresh one, confirming they'd been processed through entirely separate physical batches, on entirely separate days, 3 years apart, ruling out any single point-of-failure lab error that might explain a false result. I checked Odalis Ferreira-Reyes' own sample processing records, confirming her test had been run through our lab's standard pipeline 18 months earlier, entirely independent of mine, by a different technician, on different equipment. By roughly 2 in the morning, I had exhausted every explanation I could think of that didn't lead to the one conclusion I had spent the entire night trying not to reach. This was not a laboratory error. Robert and Yuna Kang, the 2 people who had raised me, loved me, shown up for every recital and every hospital visit of my entire childhood, were biologically, according to 2 independent, carefully verified DNA samples, not related to me at all. If you've ever discovered, sitting alone at your own desk in the middle of the night, that the most basic fact of your entire identity was quietly, invisibly false, you already know exactly the kind of stillness that takes over a person in that moment. Stay with me, because the phone call I made at 2 in the morning is only the very beginning of what I eventually uncovered. Hit subscribe so you don't lose this before I get to Larchmont. I did not call my parents that night. I want to explain why, because I think the reasoning matters considerably, and because I understand it might seem, to some people hearing this, like an unkind delay of a conversation they deserve to have immediately. I did not yet know, at 2 in the morning, whether my parents themselves had any knowledge of what I'd discovered, and I understood, even in the fog of that shock, that calling them with an accusation I couldn't yet fully explain at 2 in the morning would be cruel in a way I wasn't willing to be, regardless of what I eventually learned about their own role, or lack of one, in whatever had actually happened. Instead, I called the one person whose professional judgment I trusted more than anyone else's in a moment like that, my direct supervisor and mentor at Helix Compass, a soft-spoken, exhaustively careful clinical geneticist named Dr. Priyamvada Chowdhury, who had spent nearly 30 years in reproductive genetics before joining our company, and who had personally trained me during my first year on the job. I apologized for the hour, and then I told her, as plainly and factually as I could manage, exactly what I'd found. Priyamvada was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she asked me a question I hadn't yet thought to ask myself. "Marisol," she said carefully, "do you know the specific circumstances of your own conception? Was it a natural pregnancy, or was there any fertility treatment involved?" I told her about the 6 years of infertility my parents had described to me my entire life, about Larchmont Reproductive Associates, about the laminated stork card in my mother's keepsake box. There was another pause on the line, longer this time, and when Priyamvada spoke again, her voice had taken on the particular, measured caution I recognized from years of watching her deliver difficult news to clients. "I need to tell you something," she said, "that I want you to understand is not, on its own, proof of anything specific yet, but that I think is important context. In my 30 years in this field, I have seen a small number of cases, rare, but documented, and unfortunately more common than the profession likes to acknowledge, where fertility clinics, particularly smaller, less rigorously regulated ones operating decades ago, experienced errors in embryo or sperm handling that resulted in patients unknowingly carrying and delivering a child who was not biologically their own. Sometimes this was a genuine accident. In a small number of documented cases, it has turned out to be something considerably less accidental. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the specific, expanding horror of a possibility I had not yet allowed myself to consider. "What do you mean, less accidental?" I asked. "I don't want to speculate beyond what I actually know," Priyamvada said carefully. "But I think, before you do anything else, you need to find out everything you can about exactly what happened at that clinic, during exactly the period your parents were being treated there. And Marisol, I think you need to talk to this woman your test matched you to, Odalis, before you talk to anyone else, because she may be sitting on exactly the same discovery you are, from the opposite direction. I did not sleep that night. I spent the remaining hours before dawn doing what I have learned, across an entire career built on careful, methodical fact-gathering, to do whenever the ground beneath me feels uncertain. I built a plan, in writing, in a notes document on my laptop, laying out exactly what I needed to learn, in exactly what order, before I let myself act on any of it emotionally. I reached out to Odalys Ferreira Reyes the following afternoon, through our company's secure internal messaging system that connects matched relatives who have both opted into contact. A system I had, in fact, personally helped design protocols for. In a professional irony, I did not have the emotional bandwidth to fully appreciate at the time. I kept my first message deliberately simple and factual, explaining that our DNA databases had matched us as probable full siblings, that I worked at the company myself and had independently verified the result, and asking, gently, whether she'd be open to a phone call to discuss what either of us might know about the circumstances behind it. Odalys responded within an hour, and I want to tell you that reading her message, sitting in my apartment with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, was one of the strangest, most disorienting experiences of my entire life, because her account, delivered in her own words, from a completely independent direction, mirrored my own so closely it felt, for a moment, like reading a version of my own story written by someone else. Odalys had grown up in a loving family 2 states over, the daughter, she'd always believed, of parents who had also struggled with years of infertility before conceiving her through a fertility clinic. She had taken a recreational DNA test 18 months earlier purely out of curiosity about her ancestry, the same casual impulse that had led thousands of other people to our company's database, and had, in the process, quietly discovered, on her own, roughly a year and a half before I made the same discovery, that she showed no genetic match to either of her own parents. I want to describe what it felt like, on that first phone call, to talk to a woman I had never met, who had been carrying essentially the same devastating discovery, alone, for 18 months, out of what she described, carefully, as a fear of blowing up my parents' entire understanding of their own lives before I had any idea what had actually happened, or why. We talked for nearly 3 hours that first call, comparing every detail we could remember, the names of our respective fertility clinics, our approximate conception and birth dates, the specific circumstances our parents had described about their own treatment journeys. The detail that made both of us go completely silent, nearly simultaneously, arrived roughly 90 minutes into that call, when Odalys mentioned, almost in passing, the name of the fertility clinic her own parents had used, decades earlier, 2 states over from where I'd grown up. Larchmont Reproductive Associates, the same clinic, under the same name, listed in my own mother's keepsake box on a laminated card with a cartoon stork. "That's not possible," I said, and I remember the specific, cold clarity that settled over me as I said it, the sensation of a genetics professional's brain doing very fast, very unwelcome arithmetic in real time. Larchmont operated out of a single small building. It wasn't a chain. It wasn't a large regional network. If both our families were treated there decades apart, in different states. They weren't in different states when they were treated, Odalys said slowly, and I could hear, in her voice, the same cold clarity I was feeling myself. My parents moved after I was born. They were treated at Larchmont's original location before I was 2. Where did your parents live when they had you? I gave her the address of the small suburban town 2 towns over from where I'd grown up. The same town where Larchmont Reproductive Associates had, according to my mother's stories, operated for years before eventually closing sometime in my early childhood. It was the exact same town, the exact same clinic. 2 women, born roughly 18 months apart, both matched genetically to each other as full siblings, both raised by different families who had each, independently, believed for their entire lives that Larchmont had helped them conceive their own biological child, when in fact, whatever had actually happened at that clinic, both of us appeared, based on everything we'd learned so far, to share the same biological parents who were neither Robert and Una Kang. nor whoever Odalise had grown up believing were her own biological mother and father. If you've ever discovered that a devastating, deeply personal secret you were carrying alone was actually shared, in near-identical form, by a complete stranger who turned out to be your own biological sibling, you already know exactly the specific vertigo of that moment. Stay with me, because what Odalise and I found out over the following 4 months about Larchmont Reproductive Associates is considerably larger and considerably more deliberate than either of us initially imagined. Subscribe now, so you don't lose this before I tell you what we actually found. Odalise and I agreed, on that first call, to pursue this together, methodically, before either of us said a single word to our respective parents, because we both understood, instinctively, that whatever had happened at Larchmont decades earlier had the potential to devastate two entirely separate, entirely innocent families, and we wanted to understand the true shape of it completely before we let that devastation begin. I want to walk through the investigation that followed carefully, because I think the methodical texture of it matters as much as any single discovery within it, the same way it always has in every version of this kind of story I've ever lived through or told. The first thing I did, drawing on my own professional access and expertise, was research the actual history and eventual fate of Larchmont Reproductive Associates itself. I found, through a combination of state medical board records and old local news archives, that the clinic had operated for just under 15 years before closing abruptly, roughly 2 years after Odalise's birth and roughly 6 months after my own, under circumstances that a brief, 3-paragraph article from a regional newspaper archive described only vaguely. As a change in ownership structure, that had led the clinic's small remaining patient list to be transferred to a larger regional fertility network. I found no public record, in that initial search, of any formal investigation, malpractice finding, or regulatory action connected to the clinic's closure, which struck me, given everything Odalise and I already suspected, as either a genuine coincidence or, considerably more troubling, evidence that whatever had happened there had never actually come to light at the time. I found the clinic's founding physician's name, listed in an old state medical licensing database, a man named Dr. Harlan Voss Whitcomb, who had operated Larchmont as its sole reproductive endocrinologist for the entirety of its 15-year existence. His medical license, I found, had lapsed voluntarily roughly the same time the clinic closed, and I found no subsequent record of him practicing medicine anywhere else afterward, a detail that struck both Odalise and me, discussing it on our now regular phone calls, as considerably more suspicious than a physician simply choosing to retire. The genuinely decisive breakthrough came roughly 6 weeks into our joint investigation, when Odalise, working through her own family's old paperwork, found something in a box of her parents' documents that had survived, unexamined, for nearly 3 decades. A folder of correspondence between her parents and Larchmont, including several handwritten notes from Dr. Whitcomb himself, one of which mentioned, in passing, a name neither of us had encountered before, a clinic embryologist named Renee Solheim Castillo, described in the note as handling all sample tracking and storage going forward given our increased patient volume. I want to explain why that single name, buried in a decades-old handwritten note, mattered so much once we found it. Odalise and I had, by that point, gathered enough circumstantial information to suspect that whatever had happened to us, a switch, a mix-up, something that had resulted in both of us being carried and delivered by women who were not, biologically, our mothers, while our actual biological mother's identity remained entirely unknown, had likely occurred at the specific point in the fertility process where embryos or genetic material from different patients were handled, labeled, and stored. If a single embryologist had been responsible for that handling across the specific years both our families were being treated, she represented, potentially, the single point of contact connecting whatever had actually gone wrong. I found Renee Solheim Castillo through a combination of professional licensing records and eventually a fairly straightforward public records search, now working, I'll admit, in a state of focused, disciplined obsession that reminded me, uncomfortably, of exactly the kind of methodical fact-gathering I do for anxious clients every single day. Except this time the client was myself. She had left embryology entirely not long after Larchmont's closure, eventually building a second, entirely unrelated career as a fertility and reproductive health consultant, a career that had, over the following 2 decades, become surprisingly prominent. She had written 2 well-regarded books on navigating infertility, appeared as a guest expert on several parenting and health podcasts, and currently ran a private consulting practice that charged, according to her own website, several $100s an hour to guide wealthy clients through complicated fertility treatment decisions. I want to be honest about the considerable caution Odalys, and I exercised before drawing any conclusions about Renee's actual role in whatever had happened, because I understood, professionally and personally, exactly how damaging an unfounded accusation could be, both to her and to our own credibility. We did not, at that point, contact her directly. Instead, working with a private investigator Odalys's own attorney recommended once we finally, jointly, decided to bring legal counsel into the process. We spent the following 6 weeks building as complete a documentary record as we could of Larchmont's final years of operation. What that investigation eventually surfaced, through a combination of old state health department filings that had never been fully digitized or publicly indexed, and several former Larchmont patients the investigator was able to locate and interview, was considerably more disturbing than a simple, isolated laboratory error. At least 4 other families, treated at Larchmont during roughly the same 3-year window Odalys's, and my own parents had been patients there, had, according to the investigator's careful outreach, expressed some version of quiet, long-held uncertainty about their own children's paternity or maternity, uncertainty that most of them, we learned, had simply never had the specific occasion or resources to formally investigate through DNA testing, the way Odalys and I ultimately had. The pattern that eventually emerged, pieced together carefully over those 6 weeks, painted a picture considerably darker than accidental mishandling. State Health Department records, once the investigator located the relevant archived filings, showed that Larchmont had operated, for its final several years, with what one internal inspection report, filed roughly 18 months before the clinic's sudden closure, described as significant, repeated deficiencies in sample identification and chain of custody protocols. Deficiencies the report noted had been flagged to clinic leadership on at least 2 prior occasions without documented correction. Renee Solheim-Castillo's name appeared throughout these archived inspection records as the embryologist directly responsible for the sample handling processes being cited. The detail that finally, fully confirmed our worst suspicions arrived through one of the former patients the investigator located, a woman who had been treated at Larchmont during roughly the same period, whose own child, now an adult, had, she disclosed, quietly taken a DNA test years earlier and discovered the same kind of non-match Odalys, and I had each separately found. This woman agreed, cautiously, to speak with the investigator about her own recollection of her treatment, and mentioned something neither Odalys nor I had previously known to ask about. That Larchmont, during the specific years in question, had operated an informal, cash-based arrangement, never fully disclosed in official patient paperwork, in which certain patients, those willing to pay a substantial premium, described to this woman at the time, only vaguely as covering advanced genetic screening and priority handling, received what Dr. Whitcomb had described to her, personally, as embryos selected from our strongest available genetic material, language she had. At the time, understood as referring to enhanced screening of her own embryos, but which, considered now, in light of everything Odalys and I had discovered, suggested something considerably more troubling. The possibility that at least some patients' actual embryos had been deliberately, knowingly substituted with material from other sources entirely, sold, in effect, as a premium service to patients willing to pay for it, without those patients ever understanding that what they were purchasing was not enhanced screening, but a different embryo altogether. I want to be careful, here, about exactly what our investigation was ultimately able to establish with confidence, versus what remained, even after months of work, an educated, deeply troubling inference rather than fully proven fact. What we could establish, through documented state inspection records, correspondence, and multiple independent former patients' accounts, was that Larchmont had operated, for years, with known, repeatedly flagged deficiencies in sample tracking, under the direct operational responsibility of embryologist René Solheim-Castillo, and that at least some patients appeared to have been offered, and to have paid for, a premium arrangement whose actual mechanics were never fully or honestly disclosed to them. What we could not, ultimately, prove with the same documentary certainty was the full extent of how many families had been affected, or the precise, complete mechanics of exactly how embryos or genetic material had been substituted, mixed up, or reassigned across those final years of the clinic's operation. What we could prove, with complete, undeniable certainty, through our own DNA results and Odalys's careful family research, was considerably more personal and specific. That Odalys and I were, biologically, full siblings, born to a mother neither of us had yet identified, and that our own biological mother's identity, and the exact circumstances of how our respective birth families had each unknowingly raised the wrong child, remained, even after everything, an open question that only René Solheim-Castillo, or the records she had personally overseen, seemed likely to fully answer. I want to walk through what happened when we finally, after nearly 4 months of careful, methodical investigation, decided it was time to actually confront René Solheim-Castillo directly, because I think the way we chose to do it reflects something I've come to believe deeply, across this entire experience, about the difference between seeking the truth and seeking spectacle. We did not go to the press first. We did not, despite everything we now knew, show up unannounced at one of her paid speaking engagements, though I want to be honest that a version of me, in the angrier weeks of that investigation, genuinely considered exactly that kind of public confrontation. Instead, working with our joint attorney, we sent René a formal, carefully worded letter, laying out, precisely and factually, everything our investigation had documented: the state inspection records, the former patients' accounts, the DNA evidence establishing Odalys's and my own biological relationship and non-relationship to our respective families, and requesting a formal meeting with legal counsel present on both sides, to discuss what she might be able to tell us about our own biological origins and about the broader pattern our investigation had uncovered. She agreed to that meeting, 4 weeks later, in a conference room at her attorney's office, a meeting Odalys flew in for so we could sit across from René together, for the first time facing, in person, the woman whose decades-old handling of a small clinic's sample storage had quietly, invisibly reshaped both of our entire lives before either of us had been born. I want to describe René Solheim-Castillo as I actually encountered her, because I think it matters that she did not, sitting across that conference table, resemble any simple villain. She was in her early 60s, composed, precisely dressed, the same careful, professional warmth visible in person that had clearly built her considerable success as a fertility consultant in the decades since Larchmont's closure. She did not, when confronted with the documentation we'd assembled, immediately deny anything, a choice I've come to believe, reflecting on it since, was itself a kind of calculated legal strategy as much as any genuine impulse toward honesty. What she told us, over the course of nearly 2 hours, carefully mediated by both attorneys present, was a version of events that our own investigation had already largely anticipated, though hearing it confirmed directly, in her own voice, still landed with a specific, hollowing force neither Odalys nor I were fully prepared for. Larchmont, during its final several years, had indeed operated the informal premium arrangement our investigation had uncovered, one that René described, carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who had clearly rehearsed this account with legal counsel, as originating entirely with Dr. Whitcomb rather than herself, an arrangement in which certain patients, willing to pay substantially above the clinic's standard fees, were quietly offered embryos or donor material Whitcomb represented as superior in some vaguely defined genetic sense. Material that had, in at least several documented instances, Riene was willing to confirm under the specific legal protections our attorney had negotiated for the meeting, actually originated from other patients' own genetic material, transferred without either party's full, informed knowledge or consent. Riene maintained, throughout that meeting, that she herself had objected to the practice at the time, had flagged her concerns to Whitcomb on multiple occasions, concerns that align, notably, with the very inspection deficiencies our investigation had already documented, and had ultimately left the clinic and reproductive medicine's technical side entirely. Specifically because of her discomfort with what she described as practices I came to understand were happening that I was not able to stop or fully control, given my position at the time. She insisted, repeatedly, that she had never personally profited from the premium arrangement itself, that any financial benefit had flowed entirely to Whitcomb, and that her own subsequent silence, in the decades since, had been driven by a combination of genuine uncertainty about how to responsibly disclose what she suspected without concrete proof. And she admitted, with what appeared to be genuine, if considerably delayed, shame, a simple human unwillingness to reopen a chapter of her professional life she had spent decades trying to move past. I want to be honest about how I felt, sitting across from her, hearing that account. I did not, in that moment, feel the kind of clean, satisfying vindication I think some version of this story might promise. I felt instead something considerably more complicated. A genuine, if reluctant, willingness to believe that Riene's own role, however negligent and however long she had chosen silence over disclosure, was likely secondary to Whitcomb's, alongside a still-burning, unresolved anger that someone with her specific, detailed knowledge had spent decades building a prominent, well-compensated career, advising other anxious, hopeful families through their own fertility journeys. While the direct consequences of her prior silence continued, invisibly, to shape the lives of people like Odalys and me, and potentially, we now understood, several other families we hadn't yet identified. I asked her, directly, the one question I had come to that meeting most needing answered. Do you know who our biological mother is? Riene was quiet for a long moment, and then she told us something that, of everything disclosed in that 2-hour meeting, affected me most deeply. She did not know, with certainty, our biological mother's specific identity, but she believed, based on her own recollection of Larchmont's patient records from that specific window of time, that our biological material had most likely originated from a single, particularly prolific egg donor the clinic had used, informally and without full transparency, across multiple patients during those years. A donor Riene believed, though could not fully confirm without records she no longer had access to, might have been a young woman, herself a former patient who had donated excess eggs from her own treatment cycle in exchange for reduced fees, never fully informed, herself, about how extensively or across how many other patients her genetic material had actually been used. I want to close out the investigative portion of this story honestly, because I think the honest ending matters more than a fully resolved one. As of this recording, Odalys and I, working with our attorney and eventually, with a formal complaint filed with the state medical board regarding Riene's admitted knowledge of the historical practice, have not yet fully identified our biological mother, though the state board's own resulting investigation, once formally opened, has begun the considerably slower, more institutional process of attempting to locate additional affected families, and where possible. The original donor records Larchmont's eventual corporate successor may still retain in archived storage. Dr. Harlan Voss Whitcomb, we learned during this same period, had passed away nearly a decade earlier, meaning whatever full, complete knowledge he alone possessed about the true extent of the clinic's practices died with him, a fact that both frustrates and, in some strange way, has helped me find a specific kind of closure I don't think I'd otherwise have reached. There is no version of full confrontation with him available to me, and I have had to make peace, slowly, with the fact that some portion of my own origin story may simply remain permanently, irreducibly incomplete. I want to tell you now about the conversation I had, finally, with my parents, because I think it matters as much as anything else in this story, and because I suspect it's the part many of you have been waiting to hear about since the beginning. I told Robert and Una Kang everything, roughly 5 months after that first late-night discovery, sitting at the same dinner table where my mother had once explained cellular division with a bag of frozen peas. I want to describe their reaction honestly, because I think it defied whatever expectation I'd quietly built up over those 5 months of careful investigation. My mother cried immediately, but not, as I think some part of me had feared, out of any sense of her own diminished claim to me. She cried, she told me later once she'd composed herself enough to speak, because she understood, instantly and completely, exactly what it meant that a stranger's negligence, decades ago, had quietly stolen something from another family entirely. That somewhere, all those years ago, another woman had carried and delivered a baby she believed, completely, was her own biological daughter, a baby who was, genetically, mine to have been raised by, while I had been raised. Just as completely, and just as lovingly, by parents I now knew were not biologically mine at all. My father, characteristically quieter, characteristically more practical, asked me, gently, whether any of this changed how I felt about them. I told him honestly that it didn't, not in the way I think he feared it might. 27 years of showing up, of steady, unglamorous love, of a mother's patient explanations at a dinner table, and a father's quiet reliability, had built something between us that a DNA report, however professionally significant to my own career and my own understanding of my origins, simply could not undo or diminish. I told them, and I meant it completely, that they were still, in every way that had ever actually mattered, my parents, and that whatever else this discovery had cost me, it had not cost me that. Odalise and I have continued building our relationship in the months since, carefully, the way you build a relationship with someone who is, biologically, as close to you as any family member could be, while also, simultaneously, a complete stranger you're getting to know for the first time in your late 20s. We do not, either of us, fully know yet what to call each other, or what shape this relationship will ultimately take. What I know is that we speak weekly, that she has, in her own careful, methodical way, become one of the people I trust most completely in the entire world, born, strangely, out of the single most disorienting discovery either of us has ever experienced. Here's what I learned, sitting some evenings now in my own apartment, still doing the same careful, patient work of explaining other people's genetic results to them, though I think I do it now with a considerably deeper, more personal understanding of exactly how much weight a single strand of DNA can carry. People can build entire careers, entire decades of prominent, well-compensated public trust, on top of a silence about something they knew once was deeply, structurally wrong. But the actual truth, encoded quietly in something as small and as permanent as a strand of DNA, does not particularly care how successfully that silence has been maintained. It only needs the right test, run late enough at night by the right person, to finally, undeniably, speak for itself. If you've ever discovered that a foundational fact of your own identity was quietly, invisibly different from what you'd always believed, this story was for you. Do one thing for me this week. If you've ever taken a DNA test purely out of curiosity and set the results aside without a second look, go back and actually read them carefully, because sometimes the most significant discovery of your entire life is sitting quietly in a report you already have. Comment, the one who ran the second test, if you made it to the end with me. Share this with someone who's ever had to rebuild their understanding of where they actually come from, and subscribe to the quiet inheritance, because there's always another late night, another printer running one more report, and another truth waiting patiently in a strand of DNA for someone careful enough to finally read it.